Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is the show where I take a look at every classic Doctor Who story, plus a bunch of Big Finish, and even a couple of weird, non-audio, non-TV stories. One episode a day, 7 days a week. And today, on the 28th of April, 2018, we are starting our first and only Big Finish audio drama for Jon Pertwee's series of audio dramas with The Mega. And getting right into it, The Mega is a story about anti-war sentiments. We open with the Doctor, Joe, and Unit basically being ferried to a conference through a bunch of anti-war protesters, and these anti-war protesters, they are very, very violent. Joe even comments that, while they're radical, they are ones that they have a good point for their. They have a very good point with their ideas of, hey, it's not good that you've been making war. You stop it because, well, war is bad. And you know what? I do not blame them. It's a very, very intriguing way to start off the episode, is that you have characters who are extensively, they are against our main protagonists being a part of these anti-war demonstrations, and they don't believe that the demonstrations are meant to be. The demonstrations aren't meant to be, sort of taken seriously, mainly because there's a military organization involved, and going right into it, you have this gas which is being used as a weapon against the people in World War One, and it's shown that it's a brutal weapon. It's not meant to be, oh, this is just a normal weapon that isn't going to do any harm. No, this is confirmed. It will do harm. It doesn't matter. No matter what, it's going to do harm because it is not. It's a weapon that you really don't want out in the public. You have. So you have and the Doctor gives him a good point. And then something weird happens, that the guy behind the stuff gets killed, like, immediately. Like, and that's really where we get going. We have the idea that there's this message that England must disarm. This is the whole thing. The whole point is that England must disarm. Everything has to stop. You have to stop doing this weaponry test. Or else we're gonna destroy the world. And it's an intriguing start, but I don't necessarily want to say problem, because it isn't necessarily a problem. But a big part of why this story fails, at least this episode is at least not the best, is that it's a very slow-paced episode. It's about 33 minutes long, and as 33 minutes long, and this is just on audio, and with a couple of narrators, it's good. It's okay. Katie Manning and Richard Franklin do a good job here. It's just a little flabby. So I'm going to give The Mega, it was written by the same guy who did The Web Planet, and that has issues with pacing. So I'm going to give The Mega, episode 1, an 8 out of 10, because it's a decent start. It's a good start, and it's got me intrigued, but it just doesn't quite know where it's going to go with it. Alright, it is the 29th of April, 2018, and I just finished listening to episode 2 of The Mega. And episode 2 of The Mega, this is an episode that I'm a bit conflicted about. it's not a bad. It's I don't. It's not a bad episode, but I feel like um, Bill Strutton wrote this story just in general as what is meant to be an episode sort of from the Hartnell era. The Doctor Who, even though there are a lot of there are a lot of things that that happen. You have just sort of this. The story is paced very differently from the other six-parters and even the seven-parters of Pertwee's era so far, like, or even the six-parters of the Troughton era, where you'd still have things moving forward, because for this, there isn't as much moving forward plot-wise as just plot starts, and we're just sort of bridging. Like, this is a very much sort of a travel episode. It sort of is trying to set our characters up for the rest of the thing, and I don't think Bill Strutton does it very well. I don't blame Simon Guerrier for this, because Guerrier is, of course, just adapting a script, and not really, he is not doing his own work. He has to stick to the script. He doesn't get a choice in the matter. It's the script he has to stick to, and he's sticking to it. And I don't blame him for that, because it's actually a really decent, for the most part, a decent way of doing things. Like he's got a lot of what he wants done down. Like he gets the story to move along at a brisk pace, at a pace that just doesn't feel like it's sluggish or anything. No, it feels like it's moving from point A to point B to point C, but it just has this problem where the story itself doesn't quite know what it wants to be. You have the Mega introduced as sort of these beings of energy that if you touch them, you're electrocuted, just like, really quite similar to the Ambassadors of Death from the Ambassadors of Death, which kind of sort of hints at that this story might have been rejected partially because of the Ambassadors of Death being a story, and being a story that is sort of remembered. So like they didn't want to rehash it quite so immediately after producing the Ambassadors of Death, which makes sense in a way, but the entire story just seems to lull itself along without much in the way of plot. We have the setup of this ancient castle where there was research going on that was just sort of abandoned, and you have this Prince Cassie introduced with an army of Mega, and that's our cliffhanger. It's oddly enough, it's trying to do a very visually striking cliffhanger, but at the end of, on an audio, like I feel like Guerrier could have tried to do a cliffhanger somewhere else. You also are setting up this I'm going to call it Chekhov's biplane because it's introduced here. I feel like that's going to get some use, because they wouldn't make such a big deal out of it if it weren't going to be used later on in the story, which I don't blame them, because that's sort of how you do a lot of stories. You have to start somewhere, and that's sort of where they're starting. And a lot of the story, I don't blame them for how they're doing it and how they're starting things off, because you could go for a very very interesting sort of plot, but we're still very early on. But again, it just feels like that sluggish pace of Hartnell serials that doesn't really work here. Katie Manning and Richard Franklin are great as usual. I love Katie Manning doing the Doctor. She's great as the Doctor. She really captures Jon Pertwee's voice. But yeah, other than that, I'm going to give the Mega Episode 2 a 6 out of 10, because it's not bad, but it is slowing down a little bit. Alright, it is the 29th of April 2018, and I just finished watching Doctor Who the Mega Episode 3, well, listening to the Mega Episode 3, and as a story, this episode is interesting in the fact that, unlike the previous episode, it's really good. It's a really good increase in quality when it comes to the story. It's got this entire thing where everything sort of just doesn't just sort of happen, but everything builds itself builds itself up as the story goes on. It's a very very interesting way of doing things. You have a lot of this is, again, the Doctor and Jo getting captured and being declared as treasonous because, well, they announce that they are treasonous, and they don't really have all of the most. They have a bunch of interesting things going on. Mainly because there's a lot of, you have the prince revealing his intentions that he wants to reshape the world in his own image, but not take it over. He wants to sort of create a peaceful world. He has very, very very interesting sort of he has one of those interesting sort of things where he has this sort of philanthropic ideal of I want to help everybody, but and I'm gonna be in control, but I'm gonna give myself up afterwards, which is an interesting sort of motivation. Like, it's really interesting the way they do it. It's not quite everything's not quite the most everything's not quite the same, but everything builds up to this, and it's an interesting sort of idea. You have, of course, the Doctor and Jo get themselves captured because he sort of wants to take away free will, and he's using the Mega as a force. And the cliffhanger of this one is really where things pick up. You have the Prime Minister of the UK and Great Britain, and the Prime Minister of the UK. I think the UK is a complete thing, but the UK, but he gets vaporized, and the Mega just sort of begin their takeover, even though the Doctor and Jo end up trying to escape. So it's you have a lot of interesting you have a bunch of interesting sort of things the way this goes. It doesn't quite keep itself going. It just sort of it keeps going, and then it just sort of slows down. So it's weird. So I'm going to give the Mega episode 3, because it's a really solid episode, and I like the Doctor and Jo in it. There just isn't too much to say because there isn't too much plot. So I'm going to give the Mega episode 3 a 9 out of 10. Alright, it is the 30th of April 2018, and I just finished listening to episode 4 of the Mega, and this episode continues to be a great episode. It continues the story in a great manner as things really ramp up to be towards the conclusion. Mainly that you have a lot of a morality play between the Brigadier and Mike Yates. So much so that the Brigadier and Yates are they're ready to go disobey orders, because there's been this whole difficulty of the gas being used against people. And of course, the gas, if you're going to be brutally honest, it's immoral. It's not gas that you want to be using on people because it kills them. So you sort of, Prince Calais is in the right. You also have the Doctor essentially sending a message in Morse code to units saying SOS, further confirming that, yeah, they're prisoners. They did not defect willingly. They weren't, it wasn't their decision. If it was up to them, they probably wouldn't have defected at all, because why would they? They like Britain, and they believe in Britain as a country, and they believe that it's a good place. They don't think it's as evil as the Prince sees. I mean, it's really this more, the episode itself, there isn't too much plot to it again, but it's this morality play where things really come together, that you have a really, really solid fourth episode. You have the Doctor trying to figure out how he can get the Mega to basically turn against their master, and Britain starts to fall apart. You see scenes on the street where looters are happening, riots are happening. One issue is that this is an audio. It's not a visual medium, so it's difficult. And Simon Guerrier does a really good job of visualizing it. Don't get me wrong. He is great at writing it, and he knows that the limitations of the medium, and knows that he kind of has to find a workaround. But he still is working he's still working in the confines of an audio drama and not a visual drama. And that's something that you kind of have to take note. But other than that, yeah, the Mega episode 4 is really good. I'll give it a 9 out of 10. Alright, it is the 1st of May 2018, and I just finished listening to episode 5 of The Mega. This episode is interesting in the fact that we're back at a dip in quality. This story has been all over the place. As I've said multiple times, this one really is more of unit escaping their confines so they can help the Doctor out, and the Doctor trying to figure out really what the Mega's plans are through this entire story. Like, the Mega, don't get me wrong, they don't. Stratton hasn't really introduced their plans. They're just sort of, well, they're there, and they're the villains under Prince Cassia, but they don't really have a well-formed or even well-defined plan. It's something that really it's something that really doesn't quite work out as well. Like they just sort of are there. Like they exist only to serve the plot, which is kind of a shame. And again, the Doctor and Jo don't really do much in this episode. It's really more of unit. And there's some callbacks to the invasion, and those are nice. But it's a very much a padded 5th episode out of 6. Like it doesn't really continue to do much to be like, okay, this is where this is not only where the story is going, but this is also sort of how it's ending. Like, it's that's something that just sort of it gets done. It's something that keeps going. You have the story built on on the idea that everything can really be built to an end, but that doesn't really come to fruition. Like, you have some problems where it just sort of stays slow, and it doesn't really go anywhere. You don't really, we really aren't quite building to what you would say would be a conclusion. It's just sort of, well, here's an idea, I like this, the writer has the idea, and it's got the writer, Bill Stratton, is exploring the idea. Katie Manning is still great in the episode, and so is Richard Franklin, but there really isn't too much, that, sort of finishes itself. It just sort of keeps itself sort of going without finding itself into a conclusion, which is, it's an interesting way of doing things. Like, it's building up, and it seems like we're building up to something. It's just not the most interesting episode, especially where the other ones had more of a plot to them. It had more of an edge, it had more suspense and things. But this one really doesn't quite have that. It just sort of goes to, what would be a conclusion, and just sort of tries to find ways to get us through that conclusion and get us to an actual ending, which is, of course, coming up in the next episode. But yeah, that being said, I'm going to give the Mega episode 5 a 7 out of 10, because it's all over the place. Alright, it is still the 1st of May 2018, and I just finished listening to the Mega episode 6. This episode is, well, it's essentially our big budget action conclusion, where we realize Prince Cassia essentially goes insane. The Doctor and Jo make one last-ditch effort to escape and essentially talk reason to the Prince before Unit arrive and take everything out. This is interesting, because one of the big reveals early on is that the Prime Minister never died. He actually survived his vaporization at the hands of the Mega, because it was actually a duplicate Prime Minister, someone who just happened to look alike, which was kind of a shady, underhanded thing that a politician would do, because, well, they're politicians. And it's that sort of thing that really makes this episode sort of interesting, in the fact that it gets done, and it doesn't really change much. You have Unit still going in to take out Cassier and rescue Jo and the Doctor. I mean, that is their point, the point that they serve in this episode. They are the ones who they're trying to help out. They're trying to make sure the Doctor and Jo are safe by the end of this, even if it costs them their ending. So you have this feeling that everything sort of builds up. And what's really interesting is that Prince Cassier, who's slowly devolved into madness as the Doctor's been trying to talk him out of his plan, because of course it's a monstrous plan to destroy everything via essentially gassing them, and he slowly goes crazy because of it, and that's a very, very interesting little way of doing things. It's one of those episodes where that gets done, and things and you still have a few minutes left, and you have the Doctor defeating the Mega and getting them to go away, because it's like, well, you really don't have a point anymore, because your leader's been killed, so you just leave us alone. And that's very nice. It's a very nice sort of way to end things, as everything just sort of wraps up in a nice, neat little bow. And you really have you have, what's good about things is that the Doctor and Joe get saved, and they get flown home first class, and it's just a nice little ending to the story that really just touches your heart, and it feels like a good conclusion. But again, much like Bill Stratton's other script for the show, The Web Planet, which actually got produced, the story itself was all over the place. Like, this is a really satisfying conclusion and all, but I mean, you still have just I don't know if I could necessarily recommend this as one of the best, because it's been so all over the place. But speaking just strictly for episode 6, I would have to give the Mega episode 6, the highest score of any episode because it's probably the best one, a 10 out of 10. This is, of course, the final episode of the story. We then average up all of the scores to give the Mega a final average score of 8.16 out of 10. Thank you, everybody, for watching this episode of the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. And I will, please, if you like this episode, please leave a like, please comment, and if you subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you next time when we go back to television Doctor Who with the next story of Season 8, Colony in Space.